On today's video, we're putting a little different spin on things as we review our SHTF Options 3,200 miles from home here in Puget Sound, Washington State.
This survival dispatch video is brought to you by Nutrient Survival. Nourish your body, power your mind.
We're as far away as it gets from our home in Central Florida as far as still being in the lower 48. Whether or not you're in the Puget Sound area or not, you can use this video to put together a checklist for SHTF options regardless of where you may be, and if you're in an unfamiliar area like we are right now. The first thing we did when we got here was put together our SHTF plan just in case. Job number one was to get a paper map and make a note of some important locations on it, including unconventional places where we could find water and food, where most people wouldn't think of going to, realistic evac routes, hospitals, pharmacies, gun stores, homeless encampments, marinas, and even the local airport. I'd like to make a note that these guys right here, paper maps, man, they're a dying breed. They are hard to find. So if you go looking when you're in an unfamiliar place, truck stops is a good spot to look, Chamber of Commerce, welcome centers. But that being said, you're better off ordering them in advance, do your research in advance, pack it in your luggage, and take it with you to wherever your destination is. We're fortunate that our brother-in-law has lived in the Puget Sound area since the 1980s and easily identified the following landmarks of note on our paper map. Number one, unconventional places with water and food. We're fortunate that our family in this area lives less than 5 minutes from a very large industrial park with some huge distribution centers, including Amazon, Trader Joe's, and every other big name you can think of. These distribution centers may not have fresh food, but it's a safe assumption that they will have food products that could sustain us. Realistic evac routes. We would avoid going south or west if possible, as that would lead us into a concentrated urban area. As a result of this, there's only one realistic exit to this area by land, which is county roads that get us around a huge joint military base and keep us off the I-5 parking lot. Hospitals. This one speaks for itself just in case we need to get medical care for someone in our group. The only problem is that we'd have to head deep into those heavily populated areas. Pharmacies. This one speaks for itself too, because our stash of antibiotics and other medicines is back home in Florida. Thankfully, there are several pharmacies just minutes from our location. Gun stores. These are very important landmarks for obvious reasons as well. We're also fortunate to have a few gun stores within close proximity. Homeless encampments. There's some very large homeless communities in this area. Even at the best of times, homeless encampments are dangerous. They will only be more dangerous when people realize the rule of law no longer exists. Marinas and the regional airport. Both of these landmarks present alternative travel options that we'll cover in more depth. The abandoned brewery. There's a great location in Olympia that we could hole up in if we were in the area when SHTF happened. There's more on this to come as well. Job number two was to assess what our SHTF options are while we're visiting the Puget Sound area. So in no particular order, we came up with the following options. And not all of them are completely viable, but again, we wanted to consider what all of the options were for this particular location. So number one, occupy an abandoned and elevated building that's on a river and beside a food source. And the only reason we mention that is because we actually found such a place. Number two, commandeer a sailboat and food and supplies to go with it and get out to the coast and into the ocean as fast as possible. Number three, commandeer a plane and a pilot on the off chance that maybe we could get a flight home to Florida where our family and our fur babies are. Number four, bug in with our family here on location in Puget Sound in a rural location. Another option would be to bug out to East Washington State, that way, which is very rural and very remote. Another option, kind of a similar vein, is to bug out to Canada, that way, where there's significantly less people and a much lower likelihood of encountering people with firearms. At the end of the day, if you fail to plan, you essentially plan to fail. So let's dive into each of the options and we'll go through the pros and cons of each. Quick reminder, if you could like, comment, subscribe, and share on our videos, it helps us with the YouTube algorithm. We appreciate it tremendously. We also want to hear your thoughts on SHTF options when you're in an unfamiliar place, especially this far from home, 3,200 plus miles for us in this particular case. So jump into the comment section down below and let us know after you've watched the complete video what you think we missed and what you think maybe we got wrong, or some changes to the options that we came up with. A quick footnote before we jump into our options. Here's the scenario that we'd be up against. So this is a national level SHTF event, including an EMP or multiple EMPs that have knocked out some or most of our infrastructure and devices. So that means grid's down in most cases, internet's down in most cases, communications are down in most cases, interstates and roads are plugged full of vehicles that have been disabled by the EMP, fuel's not readily available. So taking all of that into consideration, here's option number one. Take over an abandoned brewery in Olympia, which happens to be in a really good location. So the pros of this particular building is that it's easy to defend because it's from an elevated position. And maybe it's not easy to defend, but it's easier to defend. Reasonably clean water. The river that's running through there is got a very strong current. So less likelihood, of bacteria and whatnot growing in that water. We'd still want to purify it. As well as the fact there's a significant food source right beside the abandoned brewery where there's a fish hatchery. Now, with that being said, this really isn't a viable option for us being here in Puget Sound unless we happen to find ourselves in Olympia and we couldn't get back here to Puget Sound. So, going the other direction, if we were here, we're not heading back down to Olympia, the state capital. That would be taking us into the Wolf's Den. A ton of people that direction, there'd be a ton of congestion. Nonetheless, when we found this building, our inclination was, holy crap, if we're in this area, that's where we're going. The next option on our list would be to commandeer a sailboat, food and supplies, and begin the long journey back to Florida. So the pros of going this route would be it would get us away from people fairly quickly. But on the other side of the equation, for the cons, it would require us to go back into Olympia just to get to a marina, which would be dangerous in itself. It would likely only be, a viable mode of transportation until we got to Southern California, maybe into the northern part of Mexico. But from there, we'd either have to find our way, to cross the country or cross Mexico and then the Gulf of Mexico to get home to Florida. In both instances, that would be an extremely dangerous prospect. So all things being considered, probably not the best solution for us, but we put it in here because maybe somebody is visiting another coastal town 1,000 miles from home. This type of solution, getting a sailboat, doesn't require fuel, may be the best solution for some people depending on their circumstances. The next option on our list would be to commandeer a plane and a pilot. This could potentially be the fastest way for us to get home to Florida. However, on the downside, not only would it require significant compensation to the pilot and or plane owner, it's highly likely that we would have to refuel, and probably more than once between here and Florida. So each time we were down on the ground, it'd be super dangerous and no guarantee that we could get fuel. It would also require us to go back into Olympia, just like the marina option, just like the brewery option. And again, that's like going into the Wolf's Den, because we'd be heading back to where there's a heavy concentration of people, and that would be dangerous in itself. The next option on our list would be to bug out to eastern Washington state. The advantage to that is that it's very rural, not a lot of people, very fertile farmland. The downsides would be that we would have to pass through heavily populated areas to get there, which would be extremely dangerous. We would also essentially be starting from scratch. So it would not be an easy life doing that in East Washington. We'd have no shelter, we'd have no stockpile of food or stockpile of anything else. Not a really palatable option, but if things came down to it, it is an option that should be in our plan and should be considered just in case. The last option on our list would be to bug out to Canada, which is approximately a 3-hour drive north of here. The pros would be much less people. There's approximately 11 people per square mile in Canada versus 94 people per square mile here in America. Another advantage would be there are nowhere near as many guns in Canada, so there's less likelihood of getting into a confrontation with somebody who's armed on the Canadian side of the border. And just like eastern Washington state, there's a ton of resources, very fertile land, but just like Washington state as well, we would essentially be starting all over, not to mention that it's a long trip if you're not driving or flying. And that trip would be dangerous in itself. And we'd probably be stuck with being able to carry even less stuff with us than we could to East Washington state. So again, this is not necessarily a viable option under most circumstances. But again, we've put all these things on our plan because if we have them written down and we've thought through them in advance, we're not making snap decisions during a high stress period when SHTF hits. Both my wife and I have traveled extensively for work as well as exploring America in general. You know, whether it be something simple like going out for dinner, it's always advisable, you know, to have your back against the wall so you can see everybody and everything in front of you. Or if we're considering something extreme like a national level SHTF event, we always try to do our best, you know, to get our heads wrapped around what our options are if trouble happens. And especially in this case, when we're 3,200 miles from home. You know, under most circumstances, there are usually choices. And that's why we shared this review of what SHTF options were available and realistic to varying degrees here while we're visiting the Pacific Northwest. Tell us down below what you think we missed, what we got wrong, what you would do if you were in our shoes, or even what you would do if you were somewhere unfamiliar, many miles from home. We want to hear about it as well. If you could like, comment, share, and subscribe, we really, really appreciate it. Helps us a lot with the YouTube algorithm. Y'all have a good day and come back soon.